Moonlight pooled like silver blood at the edge of the river where Chief Mako stood, bow trembling in his hand, heart hardened by decades of war and grief. Behind him, warriors waited for the order to strike. But in front of him stood a little girl, barefoot, blue-eyed, and whispering one word that shattered him: Mama. Her voice didn't belong to any settler. It belonged to the woman he buried beneath ashen memory, a voice returned through the wind in a child's lungs. As the tribe held its breath, Mako faced a choice no chief, no father, no man should ever have to make: protect his people from a stranger, or protect this girl who sounded like his dead wife. Tell me, what would you do if Mercy sounded like someone you lost? Before we begin, subscribe to this channel. They say the wind remembers things men forget. That in the hush before dusk, when cottonwood leaves shimmer like coins in a dying fire, the world whispers back the names we try to bury. On a ridge of scorched earth and memory, old Chief Mako sat watching the sun bleed into the prairie, his bow resting beside him like a weapon too tired for war. The land stretched quiet beneath a sky bruised with the last light, and every sound, every cricket's cry, every horse's exhale sounded like something once known. It was in this moment, suspended between daylight and regret, that he heard it, the soft lilt of a child's voice, carried like smoke through the cottonwoods. It wasn't the words that froze him. It was the timbre, the ache wrapped in a single syllable that pulled something buried loose from his chest. Mama, she'd said. Just once. But it was enough to bring the past charging down the hill like a ghost stampede. Years ago, he'd lost his wife to a raid that broke more than treaties. It shattered the line between man and myth inside him. He'd buried her by the river with hands that still smelled of blood and ash. And from that day, he swore no white man, no soft hand of mercy, would touch his people again. But this voice, it wasn't the enemy's voice. It was hers, or something like it. And it came not from a dream, but from the mouth of a little girl standing at the edge of camp, her feet dusty, her dress torn, her eyes wide with a kind of knowing no child should carry. The warriors rose, startled. Women gasped. Dogs barked. But Mako didn't move. His heart, so long frozen behind the jagged wall of command and memory, cracked just slightly, enough for one question to slip through. Who was this child who spoke in his wife's voice? And why did her presence make the arrow in his hand feel like a sin? He rose slowly, his bones groaning against time, and stepped forward into the wind, each step pulling him further from the man the tribe remembered and closer to something forgotten, the sound of love unburied. She stood there like something placed by the hand of fate, not wandering, not crying, just watching. Her hair was the color of late autumn bark, tangled and dry, falling in soft curls against her cheeks. Her eyes, though blue as glacier melt, held a Lakota stillness like she'd seen horses run and fires die in silence. In her hand, she held a small woven doll, the kind Mako's wife used to make in the winter huts. He felt it then, not as memory, but as a wound reopening, the scent of cornmeal, the warmth of her laugh, the lullaby she sang beneath buffalo hide. The girl blinked slowly and whispered again, this time not to anyone, just into the air. She sounds like Mama. And that was when Mako dropped his bow. It didn't clatter or strike ground with authority. It simply fell, as if it too had been waiting to be let go. Gasps rippled through the onlookers like wind across tall grass. The chief had never, not once, lowered his weapon for a stranger. And now, for a child who came from nowhere, he stood unarmed, open, and utterly still. That night, no fire was lit. The elders gathered in whispering circles, their faces carved with suspicion and wonder. Some thought the girl was a settler's bait, a cursed trick meant to fracture their strength. Others thought she was a spirit child, born of tragedy and moonlight. But Mako knew she was real. He could feel the weight of her presence the way one feels a coming storm in the joints, in the marrow, in the breath. He sat with her near the edge of the lodge circle, giving her a blanket and the remains of his stew. She ate slowly, with the quiet gratitude of someone who'd known hunger as a friend. Her eyes never left the fireless pit before them, and when he asked her name, she only whispered, "I don't remember." But he did. Not her name, no. But he remembered the way his wife used to hold her belly near the fire, speaking dreams into the unborn. A daughter, she had said once. Just once, before the war came. The war that took everything. Could this girl be her? He scolded himself for the thought. Time had passed too cruelly. But something in him, something ancient and broken, refused to let the idea go. The next morning, the council demanded answers. Where had she come from? Why had she come now? Was she a sign, a threat? Mako stood before them, his face as unreadable as canyon stone, and simply said, "She stays." No discussion, no debate, only the weight of his voice, carrying the finality of a winter frost. And though many bristled, none dared speak against the man who had led them through hunger, war, and exodus. The girl was allowed to remain, but watched closely. Mako brought her into his lodge, fed her, clothed her in deer hide, and listened to her broken memories spill out like wind chimes in a storm, a river. A fire, a mother who sang, a tall man who wept. A place with sunflowers as tall as trees. These weren't clear facts. They were feelings, dreams, but they were enough. Each night, Mako sat by her side, carving little toys and remembering the sound of his wife's humming. He told her stories of the stars and of horses that could run without rest. And though she never said much, her eyes soaked it all in. Like a sponge drawing in water, she drank the world he offered her. And with each passing day, the distance between them, that chasm of blood and time, grew narrower. Then one night, she woke screaming. Her cry cut through the village like a hawk's scream, piercing and wild. Mako rushed to her side, cradling her small, shaking form as she cried out a name. Lena, the name his wife had chosen for their unborn child. A name never spoken aloud since the raid. His breath caught. His vision swam. And in that moment, holding this trembling child whose voice was half memory and half miracle, he did not feel like a chief or a warrior or a keeper of grudges. He felt like a father who had been given one last chance. One more breath. One more winter. And though he knew the world outside their campfire would not understand, though he knew danger would follow love wherever it bloomed, he also knew this. The cottonwood wind had brought her here, and the wind never forgets. The village of the Wind Bison people sat cradled between two low hills and the winding bend of the Missouri, where the river sang low lullabies into the reeds, and the cottonwoods threw their dappled shadows over earth that had been both cradle and grave for generations. This land, sacred and stubborn, knew the weight of history. It had soaked up the blood of warriors, the tears of mothers, and the ashes of dreams both fulfilled and broken. Chief Mako bore that weight like bark bears the claw, silent, layered, and deeply scarred. Every morning before the first drumbeat, he rose from his deerskin mat and stood before the council stones, where he whispered his wife's name into the morning fog, the way a man might whisper to a fire he hopes to revive. His people watched him closely. They always had. To be chief was not just to lead. It was to carry, endlessly and without complaint, the grief of the tribe. Every decision cut like wind on raw skin. Every smile was tempered by history. That day, the one after the child had come, was like walking through a dream where past and present refused to part. The village smelled of smoked trout and boiled corn. Children played with sticks shaped like horses. Women pounded roots into paint. Men sharpened spears, tanned hides, and glanced often toward the chief's lodge, where a strange blue-eyed child now rested. Mako called a quiet council beneath the bone-frame shade of the medicine circle. His war chief, Tokala, A man with eyes like sharpened flint and a voice made of gravel spoke first. She is not one of us. Her skin is soft. Her tongue is broken. Her eyes carry the look of settlers. We do not trust what we do not know. Mako listened. He always listened. Then the old woman Nita, keeper of songs and memories, added, "But the wind brought her. And the wind has never lied to us." The debate danced in circles like wolves around a wounded elk. Duty versus mercy. Blood versus fate. Mako finally raised a hand, not with force, but with finality. "She stays," he repeated, and this time his voice didn't rise like a command, but sank like a promise into the ground beneath their feet. That afternoon, he walked with her to the river's edge, where the current moved like a sleeping snake, and showed her how to skip stones. She watched his hands carefully, mimicked his throw. Her first stone sank. Her second skipped once. Her third vanished. "Try again," he said gently, and she did, over and over. They stayed there for hours. He told her of how this river had once run red with the blood of his people, how the land had groaned beneath fire and hooves, and how his wife used to sing to the water to keep it from turning bitter. The girl looked at him and said softly, "I think she still does." He swallowed hard. That night, after most fires had dimmed and the laughter of young men faded to dreams, Mako returned to the place by the river and sat alone. In the quiet, the world seemed to breathe. And in that breath, he heard not just memory, but the echo of something becoming new. A bond, a hope, a legacy unburied. And though he feared what storms might come, he vowed then and there, if the girl was the wind's gift, he would not let her be taken. Not again. Not this time. The girl moved through the village like a ghost remembered, never quite touching the ground, never fully trusted nor truly feared, a presence between the worlds of what was and what might be. The children followed her from a distance at first, peering from behind lean-tos and bark shelters, whispering stories they had heard their mothers murmur when they thought no one listened. She did not speak much, not because she could not, but because the air around her always felt too sacred for noise, as if she carried inside her the last breath of someone beloved. Her small feet padded silently through soil packed with memory, her hands ever clutching the frayed doll that looked more like a prayer than a toy. Mako watched her always, not with ownership or suspicion, but with the long stare of a man trying to stitch two separate lifetimes together through the thread of a child's presence. He saw how she knelt by the fire circle each morning, mimicking rituals she could not possibly know. How she traced the beads on Nita's medicine pouch with reverence, whispering old songs with words half-formed but hauntingly familiar. The tribe began to notice. Elders whispered in the corners of smoke lodges, saying she walked like the river ran, with memory in her stride. Young mothers caught themselves weeping when the girl glanced their way with eyes too old for her face. And still she said almost nothing. The name Lena had not passed her lips again since that one night, but Mako heard it every time she turned her head toward the wind. He gave her no name of his own, for something told him it would be wrong to rename a story already in motion. Instead, the people called her Little Echo. It was Nita who first spoke it aloud, after the girl recited a half-remembered lullaby that had not been sung in the village since Mako's wife died. "She echoes someone we lost," the old woman said, her voice brittle as deer bone. And so the name clung to her, soft and spectral. But even as the villagers slowly warmed to her, questions lingered like smoke that would not clear. Where had she come from? No tracks led to her. No rider or settler's trail explained her arrival. She had simply been, as if the earth had birthed her from sorrow. Some believed she was a sign from the spirits, proof that peace might be possible in a world still licking its wounds. Others saw her as a curse, a harbinger of conflict disguised in innocence. One day, a young hunter named Roland, bitter from his brother's death in a settler skirmish, challenged Mako in front of the entire village. Why do we keep the child? She is not one of us. Her blood is not pure, and her silence is not trust. What if she was sent to listen, to betray us? The words sliced the air like a blade. Mako stepped forward, his age making no dent in his stature. He looked not at Roland, but at the girl, who stood behind him with her doll pressed to her chest. Then he spoke low and slow. If the spirits had sent someone to destroy us, they would not have wrapped her in my wife's voice. They would not have buried her tears in my arms. Roland fell silent, not convinced, but overruled by something deeper than fear, reverence. The seasons turned slowly. Autumn bled into winter with the hush of a held breath. The girl grew not taller, but fuller somehow, her presence expanding like smoke around the heart of the village. Mako taught her how to read the wind, how to hear deer before seeing them, how to braid willow bark into snares and prayers. She learned quickly, not just with her hands, but with a kind of aching joy, as if each task restored something she had never known she missed. At night, she sat beside him, drawing shapes in the dirt and listening to stories of the ancestors. She never interrupted, only nodded, her eyes gleaming with a knowing that unsettled even the elders. One evening, as the snow began to whisper against the lodge skins, Mako found her kneeling by the river, her hands cupped to catch the moon's reflection. She looked up and asked, "Was Mama kind?" It was the first time she had asked about his wife directly. The question cracked something inside him he had long thought petrified. "She sang with her hands," he answered after a pause. "Even when she worked. Even when she hurt. You remind me of her." The girl nodded solemnly, as if confirming something already known. "Sometimes I see her in my dreams. She sings to the stars. She wears feathers in her hair and smells like sweet grass." Mako closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to believe in something he could not explain. He told the council that winter that the girl would remain under his protection, not as a ward, but as his own. Some nodded, others bristled, but no one spoke against him. Not yet. And in that moment, as frost rimmed the trees and wolves howled far beyond the hills, Mako felt something he had not felt since the day his wife died. Hope. Hope that maybe the past had not only taken, but left behind a thread of redemption to follow. The girl, unnamed but not unloved, had become the quiet center of a story still unfolding. And Mako, for all his pain and all his years, was ready to follow wherever it led, even if it meant losing everything again. Because sometimes a single voice, soft, broken, and achingly familiar, was enough to raise the dead and teach a hardened warrior how to become a father again. There were nights when the past came back not as memories, but as specters wrapped in wind and fire. Mako would sit beneath the moon-soaked sky, far from the lodge circle, and listen to the coyotes echo the screams of men who never came home. He had led them once 20 strong into a valley painted with the soft colors of morning and returned alone, their blood crusted in the seams of his shirt, their names burning behind his eyes. It was supposed to be a defense, a warning to a settler camp pressing too close to sacred hunting grounds. But the warning turned into slaughter, the kind that leaves mothers breathless and elders silent. His wife had begged him not to go. She had placed her hands on his chest that night and whispered prayers meant to soften war. Her final words to him were not of fear, but of the child inside her. Come home. Come home to her. He never did. At least not as the man who left. By the time he returned, the retaliatory strike had already come. A raid, swift and unmerciful, had burned half the village and taken his wife with it. They found her in the river, her fingers still curled around a piece of beadwork meant for their daughter. And though the child was gone, no one found her body. Some said she died. Others whispered she had been taken. Mako buried both stories. He took his grief like a knife and carved it into silence, into vengeance, into leadership. The tribe needed him strong, and so he was. But strength became stone, and the stone grew moss until only the wind knew what was buried beneath. Now years later, that wind had returned in the shape of a child, silent and sure, carrying his wife's lullabies in her breath. He watched her sleep by the fire, her chest rising with small rhythmic peace, and wondered how many times he had chosen war over wonder, retaliation over reconciliation. Every moment with the girl chipped at the armor he had worn for too long. When she reached for his hand without fear, when she hummed songs she could not possibly know, when she looked at him with recognition not born from sight, he saw not just what he had lost, but what he had become. He was not the man she needed. Not yet. And so, he returned to the place it had begun, the hollow ridge above the river bend, where his warriors had died and his soul had hardened. He knelt there in the red dust, pressed his forehead to the ground, and wept. Not like a warrior, not like a chief, like a father who had failed. The earth did not judge him. It listened. It remembered. And in that silent communion, he made a vow. If the girl was truly his daughter, if blood or spirit or memory had brought her back, then he would not fail her again. He would walk the long road back to the man his wife believed in. Not for honor, not for legacy, but for love. The village saw the change in him. He walked slower now, more deliberately. He spoke with a tenderness they had forgotten he possessed. And though he remained fierce in counsel, there was something gentler behind his eyes. One day, as he taught the girl how to tie a snare from sinew and bent wood, she looked up and said, "I dreamed of Mama again." She was brushing my hair by the fire. "You were singing." He had never sung. Not since the raid. Not since the sky burned and his heart turned to cinder. And yet, that night, when the stars opened like wounds across the sky, he lifted his voice. It cracked and faltered, but the girl leaned into his shoulder and closed her eyes. And that, he thought, was enough. There were still those in the village who watched with unease. Not all were willing to forgive the ghost of a child for reopening old wounds. Some believed she brought danger with her, a storm waiting on the horizon. And maybe she did. But Mako no longer feared it. He had already lived through the worst a man could endure. What remained was a choice, to continue surviving or to begin healing. And with the girl's hand in his, he chose the latter. In the quiet hours before dawn, he would sit and carve her stories into bone, into wood, into earth. Not just so the tribe would remember, but so she would know she was never truly lost. Only waiting for the wind to bring her home. It was near the end of a brittle spring, the kind where frost still clawed at the edge of morning fires, when the truth arrived like a thunderclap wrapped in the softest breath. The girl Little Echo, as the people called her, had taken to wandering near the old burnt cottonwoods that marked the edge of where the settler trails once crossed into Lakota lands. Mako followed at a distance, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Something in her behavior had changed. She no longer hummed the old songs. She no longer clung to her doll. Instead, she sat silently on a stump each afternoon, tracing the air with her fingers like a blind seer pulling memories from smoke. One day, he sat beside her without a word, waiting. Minutes passed like hours. Then she turned and said, quietly, almost too soft for the wind to carry, "I saw their faces. The ones who raised me." Mako did not speak, but his hand tightened slightly on the walking staff between them. "They weren't my blood," she continued, her voice distant, "but they loved me like I was. A man with silver whiskers and hands that smelled like horses. A woman who wore blue ribbons and called me Lena." The name cut through Mako like the first arrow of battle. He stared ahead, forcing his heart to stay slow. "They died when the fever came," the girl said, and her eyes seemed to age as she spoke. "Buried them in the roots of a willow tree, then wandered. I followed the birds. I don't know why I kept walking. I just did." Her voice faltered. Then I saw the ridge. The smoke. I followed it. I didn't know what I was looking for. But when I heard your voice in the wind, I knew I'd found it. Mako turned to her. Who told you your name was Lena? He asked, his voice lower than thunder, heavier than grief. She reached into the pouch tied around her waist and pulled out a strip of faded blue cloth, the kind used to bind baby bundles, embroidered in Lakota symbols. His wife's symbols. Mako took it with hands that trembled, traced the stitching he once watched his wife sew by firelight. The cloth smelled faintly of cedar and old milkweed. It was real. Not dream. Not memory. Real. His throat closed. The girl whispered. She gave it to the white woman. Told her to keep me safe. Told her to teach me the old ways, if she could. But they didn't know enough. Just pieces, fragments. Mako stared at her, the child of blood and smoke and war, and saw in her face not just his wife's memory, but her final mercy. She had not perished without hope. She had found a way to save their child, to carry her across the river of death and place her gently into the arms of strangers, who would never know the full weight of their gift. And now that child had found her way home, led not by maps or stories, but by instinct, by echo, by the invisible threads that bind soul to soul. The twist in his chest became something holy. A sob broke loose, sharp and unsheath-like. He reached for her, and she came willingly, nestling against him like the missing half of a breath. For the first time he said her name aloud, Lena. She nodded, her forehead against his shoulder. That's me. The revelation shook the village like distant thunder. Word spread faster than fire in dry grass. Some rejoiced. Others recoiled. There were those who said it was impossible, that no child could survive both the raid and the fever. That no one could walk back into a bloodline broken so many years ago. But the old ones believed. Nita wept and placed her song beads at Lena's feet. Even Tokala, the ever-doubtful war chief, knelt before the girl and asked for her forgiveness. Yet peace is a fragile thing. And in the quiet, beneath the awe and celebration, darker whispers grew. Questions of blood, of tribal law, of rightful inheritance. If she was truly Mako's daughter, she was not only his blood, she was his heir. And heirs, even young ones, carried power. For some, that power threatened more than tradition. It threatened ambition. Mako sensed the shift. He felt the heat of gazes at his back during council. He heard the edge in the voice of his brother, Haken, who had long stood beside him, but always one step too close to his seat. Haken, whose children had grown strong, whose visions had turned more toward politics than peace. The twist had come not only to heal, but to test. Still, Mako stood firm. He gathered the people beneath the full moon, cradled Lena in the crook of his arm, and told the story he had never shared, of the day he buried his wife, of the missing child, of the years spent in grief. He held the cloth high for all to see. He spoke the name Lena with reverence, and he declared before sky and fire and earth, "This is my daughter, not by faith, not by chance, but by blood. She has returned, and she will be protected." The flames cracked. The people bowed. But in the shadows, the eyes of envy glinted like coals, waiting for a careless spark. Lena, unaware of the storm her truth had stirred, curled beneath a buffalo blanket that night and whispered one word before sleep, "Papa." And in that single breath, Mako found what no victory had ever given him, peace. But peace, like spring frost, never lasts. Belonging, Mako had learned, was not a matter of blood alone. It was a thing shaped in silence, tested by fire, and broken 100 times before it could be mended. After the truth about Lena spread through the village, life did not settle into the peace Mako had hoped for. Instead, the air thickened with questions that could not be answered by lineage alone. Lena had returned by spirit and miracle, but her skin still bore the pale traces of her adoptive mother. And her tongue, though catching fast to Lakota words, often slipped back into the settler's cadence when she dreamed or cried. To some, she was a bridge between two worlds. To others, she was a wound reopened. There were quiet conversations among the women who still bore the memory of lost sons and burned homes, who remembered what the settlers had taken, and feared what this child's return might bring. And there were louder voices, younger warriors who saw her as a threat to the tribe's purity, to its survival in a world already closing in on them. Hakon's voice, though cloaked in courtesy, began to rise among them. "A chief must protect not just blood," he said one evening around the fire circle, "but tradition. The earth remembers who it raised." Mako said nothing in return that night, but Lena, curled beside him, asked afterward, "Does that mean I don't belong here?" He looked at her, this child who bore his eyes in her mother's spirit, and felt something hot rise in his throat. "You belong where the wind placed you. You belong with me." But doubt is a poison that drips slow. Over the weeks, small signs of tension cracked the village's calm. A boy tripped Lena as she carried firewood. An elder refused to bless her during a ritual. One morning, a painted message appeared on Mako's lodge door: "Blood fades." Mako tightened security around his home, placed trusted guards near Lena, but forbade them from acting with violence. He would not meet fear with force. Not again. Instead, he called a sacred gathering, a circle of song and smoke, inviting elders and youth alike to speak their hearts. It was there that the true test came. One by one, voices rose. Some in her defense, telling of Lena's kindness, her eagerness to learn, the song she now sang in perfect cadence. Others, more hesitant, spoke of fear not of the child, but of what she represented: change, uncertainty, the erasure of lines that had once defined who they were. When it was Mako's turn, he did not stand. He simply placed a carved wooden figurine of his wife into the fire and said, "She chose to save our child. In doing so, she chose mercy over vengeance. I will not undo that mercy with cowardice." The fire cracked. The council fell silent. And still, not all were swayed. Later that week, a group of hunters refused to take Lena's offerings for their meal blessing. Another child was told not to play with her. These wounds, though subtle, began to shape the girl. She grew quieter, more withdrawn. Her smile, once bright like spring thaw, began to fade. Mako, watching, felt the weight of leadership bear down like never before. He had led his people through famine, through war, through betrayal. But he had never had to lead them through forgiveness. He began walking the village with her daily, speaking openly about her heritage, her return. Teaching children alongside her, speaking her name with honor in every story he told. Slowly some began to soften. A boy named Wana, whose father had once cursed Lena's presence, began teaching her how to braid river grass into whistles. An old woman placed a bracelet of turquoise beads in her palm and said, "Your mother's hands were gentle. Yours are too." But still, the resistance lingered. And Mako knew that until the tribe faced what had been buried beneath their grief, the hatred, the fear, the unspoken guilt true belonging would remain out of reach. One night, he took Lena to the burial mounds outside the village, where the wind spoke in softer tones. He pointed to the stars. "Do you know what they say about our ancestors?" She shook her head. "That they do not sleep. They wait for us to finish their songs, for us to carry their stories farther than they could." He placed her hand over his heart. "This is where you come from. Not the blood, not the name, but the story. And stories are stronger than hate." She nodded, eyes full of stars and tears. The next morning, she stood before the village circle, her voice small but sure. "I am Lena. My mother was Lakota. My father is your chief. I remember the songs. I am learning the ways. I am not here to change what you are. I am here to remember it." A long silence followed. Then Nita rose, placed her old hand on the girl's shoulder, and said, "Then let us help you remember." And slowly others followed. Not all, but enough. Enough to begin again. In the ashes of two worlds, something new was stirring, not a bridge, not a divide, but a circle reforged in pain and patience. And though Mako knew more trials would come, he also knew this: belonging is not inherited. It is earned, one heartbeat at a time. The first frost came early that year, like a warning carved into the wind. By mid-moon, the ground had hardened beneath the horses' hooves, and the berry bushes had withered into brittle shadows. The river slowed, thickening with ice at its edges, and the game began to disappear into the quiet corners of the forest. Winter was always a trial, but this one promised to be cruel. The stores of dried meat and roots gathered in autumn were already dwindling, and with each passing week, the fires seemed to burn with less conviction. Hunger crept not as a roar, but as a whisper, gnawing at the ribs of children and thinning the cheeks of the old. Mako had seen hard winters before. He bore their scars on his fingers and in the way he measured every portion of food. But this time, the hardship carried an edge sharper than cold. Outsiders had begun appearing again, settlers desperate for land, soldiers pushing through with wagons and rifles, missionaries with hollow smiles and heavy books. They came not with treaties, but with hunger of their own, and that made them dangerous. The tribe moved its lodges closer to the valley edge, seeking shelter from the winds and avoiding confrontation, but whispers of conflict still rode in with every horse returning from the outer trails. And in the center of all this, the girl, Lena, the daughter reborn from sorrow, the child who carried both hope and risk in equal measure. There were murmurs again. Quiet at first, then louder as the cold deepened. Some said her presence had angered the spirits, that perhaps she was not meant to return, that her place in the circle disrupted the balance between the seen and unseen. Others feared she would be a target, that her pale skin, her outsider's tongue, would draw the attention of those who saw her as either prize or threat. Tokala, the war chief, approached Mako one evening, his face drawn with concern. "We are watched," he said simply, "and the girl shines like a torch in darkness. They will come, and they will ask questions we cannot afford to answer." Mako nodded. He had seen the same eyes watching from the tree lines. He had heard the same footfalls where there should have been silence. He had also seen Lena drawing maps in the dirt, describing things no child her age should know: the color of missionary coats, the way gun barrels glinted in sunlight, the sound of horses trained for war. Memories from her lost years, perhaps, or warnings wrapped in innocence. The council met in secret. Voices rose. Not against Mako, none dared that openly, but around him. Suggestions cloaked in respect. Perhaps the girl should be taken deeper into the forest, hidden until spring. Perhaps a small party could escort her to a distant village where she might be safe. Perhaps she should be sent away entirely. Mako listened, stone-faced. He did not speak until all had exhausted their caution and their cowardice. Then he stood. "You would send away a child because the winter bites and the enemy watches. You would undo the sacrifice of my wife because it is cold and your bellies ache. I will not." His voice silenced the lodge. But silence was not agreement. That night he kept Lena close. He taught her how to stoke a fire to burn longer, how to spot footprints in snow, how to stay still when fear clawed at the throat. She listened, absorbing every word like a sacred verse. She did not cry, not even when he told her that she might need to run one day and run alone. "If they come for you," he said, "you go to the willow tree. You wait. I will find you." But it was not the soldiers who came first. It was his own people. A faction, small but desperate, led by a young hunter named Tayan, whose brother had died in a raid the year before. He and a few others stormed the lodge in the dead of night, masks over their faces, blades drawn not to kill, but to take. To remove Lena without blood, without ceremony. They underestimated the chief. Mako met them at the door, spear in hand, eyes ablaze with a fury born not of power, but of love. There was no battle. Just a standoff. Words like sparks, silence like thunder. In the end, Taein backed away, shamed by his own fear, but not defeated. You would risk us all for her? He spat. Mako did not answer. He didn't need to. Lena had woken during the confrontation and stood now behind him, unflinching. Her hand rested on his back. Her presence, small and sure, was answer enough. But the attack changed things. Divisions deepened. Trust fractured. And all the while, the winter grew colder. One elder died from sickness. A child lost fingers to frostbite. The hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not. And though Mako rationed his own meals, giving half to Lena, he could see the toll it was taking. She was thinner now. Her cheeks hollowed. Her voice softer. But her eyes, those stayed strong. And that strength frightened people as much as it inspired them. It reminded them that she was not just a child. She was the daughter of legend and loss. A symbol. And symbols are dangerous when food runs out and tempers fray. One evening, as the moon hung low like a promise half kept, Haken came to Mako's lodge. He brought no weapon, only words. The people suffer, he said. And they look to you for salvation, not sentiment. You must choose, brother. Her or them. Mako stared at him for a long time. Then he said, she is them. She is the part we tried to bury. And I will not bury her again. Haken left in silence, but Mako knew then what would come next. It would not be the soldiers. It would not be hunger. It would be betrayal. And it would come from within. He watched Lena sleep that night, her breath shallow but steady, her small hand clutching the carved doll she'd never quite let go. He traced the line of her brow, so much like her mother's, and whispered, whatever comes, I will not let them take you. Not again. The betrayal did not arrive with fire or war paint, but with silence. A silence so deliberate, it felt orchestrated, like the moment before a blade is drawn behind your back. It came in the days after the failed attempt to remove Lena, when the village settled into a deceptive calm. People spoke more softly, nodded with forced politeness, and carried out their routines as though nothing had shifted, but something had. Mako felt it in his bones, in the way Tokala avoided his gaze, in how Nita kept her prayers shorter, sharper. Even the dogs barked less as if waiting. And at the center of this stillness, Haken smiled too much. He appeared beside Mako at every council meeting, offered him tea before sunrise, told stories at the fire with his arm around the children. It was too much warmth, too quickly kindled. Mako had known his brother his whole life. He remembered the way Haken wept as a boy when their father died, how he'd trained in the shadows of his older brother's legacy, never quite earning the same reverence. There had always been something simmering beneath Haken's devotion, a hunger not for service, but for stature. And now that hunger had shape. It was Lena. One cold morning, Lena did not come to the river where Mako was waiting to teach her the old prayer of the thaw. He returned to the lodge and found her gone, her doll left behind, its woven face torn slightly at the seam. Panic was a fire that moved faster than thought. Mako summoned his guards, questioned everyone, scoured the trail with the urgency of a man chasing not a child but a soul ripped from his chest. That evening, a message arrived on a scrap of bark, written in a clumsy hand, using both Lakota symbols and the settler's alphabet. Come alone. By moonlight. No weapons. She lives. Mako stood before the council that night, the bark clenched in his fist, his eyes dim with fury. One of you has done this, he said. and there will be no forgiveness if she is harmed. The room split down the middle, those who believed the chief had lost too much to think clearly, and those who saw the lines between honor and rebellion beginning to blur. Haken was not present. That told Mako everything he needed to know. He rode alone before moonrise, as instructed, through the frost-bitten plains and into the hollow where the willows bowed like grieving mothers. There, beneath their weeping branches, stood Haken, cloak drawn tight, spear grounded but not lowered. And beside him, bound but unhurt, was Lena. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes steady. "You would betray your blood for what?" Mako growled. Haken didn't flinch. "You betrayed the tribe first," he said evenly. "You put one child above many. You chose the past over the future." Mako stepped forward. "She is the future. She carries both worlds. She can heal what we've broken, or doom what we've preserved," Haken snapped. "You made her the center of our fire. But our people freeze while you burn with father's guilt." The two brothers stood in silence, years of rivalry and pain tightening the space between them like a noose. Finally Mako said, "Let her go. This doesn't have to end in blood." Haken smiled, a sadness in it. "But it already has." From the shadows, others emerged, not settlers, not enemies, but warriors of their own tribe, men who had followed Mako into battle, now standing beside Haken, spears, bows, torches. Mako was outnumbered. And yet, he stepped forward, dropping his own spear, spreading his arms. "Then take me. Let her walk free." Lena cried out, struggling against her bonds. Haken hesitated. This was not the ending he had envisioned. There was no glory in killing an unarmed brother. No legacy in seizing power over a broken man. One of the younger warriors spoke. "He is unarmed. She is a child. This is not our way." The words cracked the unity of the betrayal. Another stepped back. And another. Haken saw the power slipping from his hands. "You would follow a man who chooses weakness?" He shouted. "He chooses love," said Tokala quietly, stepping into the light. His eyes met Mako's. "And love, brother, is the only thing left that can save us." Haken trembled. Then, with a cry born of years buried beneath duty and jealousy, he dropped his spear and fled into the trees, vanishing like smoke. Mako rushed to Lena, cutting her bonds, pulling her into his arms. She was shivering, not from cold, but from the weight of being wanted and taken and held again. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "Always," he said. The others stood silent. The betrayal had been revealed, and in its collapse, something stronger had taken its place, a tribe not ruled by fear, but reforged by choice. But the damage had been done, and the road ahead would demand more than forgiveness. It would demand sacrifice. The snow was falling hard when the judgment came, soft as ash but heavy as fate. Mako stood before the council in the heart of the village. The people circled around him like stones around a grave. Behind him, Lena sat quietly on a stump, her feet barely touching the ground, her breath clouding the cold air with every slow, measured exhale. The fire cracked in the center, casting shifting shadows that danced between the gathered faces, some stern, some torn, some unreadable. Haken had returned, not with violence, but with words sharpened by guilt and ambition. He knelt before the council, head bowed, claiming remorse for his actions. He had only meant to protect the tribe, he said. He had feared for their future, feared Mako's grief had blinded him to the dangers the child posed. He said these things with the voice of a man who practiced sorrow like a song. But his eyes never once met Mako's. The council murmured in debate. Forgiveness or exile? Redemption or punishment? Blood or bond? The decision, in truth, lay with Mako alone. He was still chief, still the one whose voice carried weight beyond the drums. But in the silence that stretched between breaths, he felt the shifting ground beneath him, Leadership, like winter, is not a season but a reckoning. He looked to Lena, her small hands wrapped around the wooden doll, now restitched with thread and care. He looked to Hakan, whose face wore the mask of a man who believed regret could buy back betrayal. And he looked to the people, his people who had bled beside him in war, who had followed him through hunger and drought, who had trusted him through silence and fire. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his bow, not to draw it, not to wield it, but to lift it into the center of the fire. The flames caught the leather grip first, then the sinew, then the wood, until it curled and cracked and split in two. The sound echoed like thunder across the clearing. Gasps followed. Even Hakan flinched. Mako turned to them all. "This is the last weapon I will raise in your name," he said. "If you believe leadership is only preserved through punishment, then take my seat. Take my title. But I will not spill my brother's blood. And I will not sacrifice my daughter to keep your peace." He stepped back, placed his hands on Lena's shoulders. "I choose love, even if it costs me everything else." For a long time no one moved. The fire roared higher, the snow fell thicker, and the people stood suspended between tradition and transformation. Then Nita, oldest among them, stepped forward. She placed her walking stick in the snow, leaned heavily on it, and said, "The bow is broken. The circle must bend or break with it." Tokala followed. "I once believed war made us strong, but it only made us hungry. Today, I will not feed that hunger." One by one, others turned away from Hakan, not in hatred but in quiet, resolute rejection. He bowed his head again, but this time not in false contrition. This time, it was to accept his exile. Mako did not watch him leave. He only turned to Lena, pulled her close, and whispered something the wind swallowed before it reached any ear but hers. That night, Mako packed only what could be carried: a satchel of dried meat, a blade, the medicine pouch left by his wife, and Lena's hand in his. The fire in the village still burned behind them, but they did not look back. They walked through the snow, away from the circle, into the open plains where stars pierced the sky like pinholes in a dark cloth. They walked not as fugitives but as pilgrims, not escaping but beginning again. The bow was broken, but in its ashes something stronger might rise. The snow did not stop the next day, nor the one after. Mako and Lena walked beneath a sky heavy with silence, the kind of silence that falls when a life is shed like old skin and a new one begins without fanfare. The land stretched ahead wide, endless, covered in frost and shadow. Behind them, the smoke from the village fire thinned into the horizon until it disappeared entirely, and they were left with only each other, footprints trailing behind them like a fragile thread of memory. Mako had not spoken much since they left. His voice, once the compass of a people, now carried only for Lena. He taught her how to read the wind, how to find tracks beneath snow, how to move with the rhythm of the land instead of against it. They found shelter in the hollows of canyons, in the crook of pine roots, beneath rock faces that held the warmth of yesterday's sun. Food was scarce but sufficient. Rabbits, dried berries, the last pieces of smoked elk from Mako's pack. At night, he'd show her constellations, telling stories not of glory, but of sorrow and redemption. Stories he'd never told before. Stories meant only for her. Lena did not ask about the village, not even once. She had watched her father burn his bow, had heard the finality in his footsteps. Her silence was not grief, but something older, deeper. A growing understanding that love sometimes costs everything and is still worth it. In their wandering, they came upon forgotten places, an abandoned settler cabin overtaken by vines and ash, an old battlefield where broken arrows still poked through the snow like bones, a river so quiet it felt holy. In each place, Mako would stop, close his eyes, and breathe, as if weighing the memories left behind. Once, in a grove of twisted oak, he found a carving on a tree his wife's name. faded but unmistakable. He placed his hand over it and whispered her name like a prayer, then turned to Lena and said, "She never stopped leaving signs for us." And in that moment, Lena placed her small hand beside his, and together, they felt the bark pulse beneath their fingers like a heartbeat too long hidden. They spoke more as weeks passed, of what might come next, of what it meant to be neither here nor there, to carry the blood of one world and the memory of another. Mako told her, "You are not half of anything. You are whole. You are the beginning of something that hasn't been written yet." In the evenings they built fires that smoked only lightly, so as not to be seen from afar. These fires became sacred, not for their warmth, but for their quiet companionship. They shared stories in the crackle of flame, stories they built together. One night, Lena asked him, "Are we lost?" He shook his head. "No, we're just not where we're going yet." They came upon a meadow after the third moon. It was tucked between two hills, fed by a creek that sang even in winter, with stones arranged by no hand, but still perfect. It was a place untouched by blood or sorrow. A place where the snow felt gentle, not punishing. Mako looked around, listened to the wind, then nodded once. "This is it," he said. They built a home from earth and bark, not much larger than a lodge, but strong. Lena helped dig, carry, shape. She was growing stronger, her limbs lean with labor, her eyes bright despite the cold. Mako carved a new bow not for war, but for hunting, with the grain of willow bending easily beneath his hands. He carved beads and hung them over the door. He taught Lena songs to greet the sun, and she taught him how to laugh again. There were no enemies here, no counsel, no expectations, only the sound of two hearts slowly healing in the wild. And yet, exile never leaves fully. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Mako would wake and stare at the sky, remembering the fire circle, the weight of leadership, the betrayal of his brother. He never spoke of it, but Lena knew. She would place her hand over his and whisper, "I'm still here." And he would nod, because that was all he needed. They survived 2 winters in that meadow. They planted small gardens come spring, foraged in the woods, traded occasionally with distant travelers. Word of the former chief of the Wind Bison people reached some ears, but no one came. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because the world had already taken too much from Mako to demand anything more. But the fire without smoke still burned. It burned in the way Lena sang old songs while collecting water, in the way Mako carved his wife's face into stone, in the way they carried stories never told before, now kept alive between them. Not all exiles are punishments. Some are sanctuaries. And in that quiet meadow, where the wind remembered and the creek forgave, Mako and Lena built something rarer than peace. They built understanding. They built legacy. They built home. Time unfolded like the petals of a prairie flower, slow, silent, sacred. In the quiet meadow they now called home, seasons passed not in haste, but in patient, deliberate cycles. Spring brought soft rains and blooming wildflowers, the hills washing themselves clean of the winter's long shadow. Summer buzzed with bees and laughter as Lena, now nearing womanhood, moved with confidence between rows of wild herbs and stone paths laid by her own hands. Mako watched her grow, and with every new skill she mastered, every song she remembered or created anew, he felt the ache of his exile dull into something gentler, something like grace. She had grown tall like her mother, with legs made strong by walking and eyes sharpened by observation. Her hair was long now, always braided with care, often decorated with bits of feathers or bone or bright river stones she found near the stream. But more than how she looked, it was how she moved, grounded, present, aware, that made Mako certain his daughter had become something greater than even he had hoped. Not quite the child of the old world, not fully of the new, but something forged from the middle, stronger because of both. Each morning, she rose before the sun and lit the fire in silence, as Mako had once done. She spoke the morning prayer without stumbling now. Then she would fetch water, and often pause at the river's edge to sing a few notes of her own making, melodies that echoed the past but belonged wholly to her. Mako had begun to write their stories on leather strips, using pigments made from crushed berries and soot. He bound them together with sinew, carving symbols into the bark wall above their hearth. One for each season. One for each story Lena had lived or revived. She was the heartbeat of their legacy now, and he knew it. She could track elk through dense woods, read the wind by the curve of grass, speak to birds without words. But more importantly, she listened to the land, to her own intuition, to him. She carried his teachings not as duty, but as inheritance, worn with pride. One day, while tending to their small patch of maize, she turned to him and said, "Tell me the story again. The one about how Mama braided songs into her hair." And Mako smiled, sitting beside her, voice low and warm. She said every strand carried memory, that the left side held the voices of women before her, that the right side was for the daughters not yet born. Lena touched her own braid. "Then I will never cut it, not even when you're old?" He teased, she grinned. Especially then. They built a second lodge, smaller, for storage, then another when a wayward traveler needed a place to rest. Word had slowly trickled across the valleys about the meadow, a place of quiet, of healing. Some came seeking medicine. Others, just a night's peace. Mako never turned them away. And Lena, ever the quiet flame, would sit and listen to their stories, learning more about the world beyond the hills. One woman, old and blind, came with a broken flute and left with a new song taught to her by Lena. A boy, orphaned by settlers and raised by wolves, came snarling and left laughing. Their home became more than shelter. It became sanctuary. And through it all, the bond between father and daughter deepened. Mako grew slower with time. His shoulders ached, his hands trembled more than before. But his eyes still held the sharp glint of the hawk, especially when watching Lena work or speak. She began taking longer walks alone, not out of rebellion, but out of readiness. She was seeking something, a vision, perhaps. Or just herself. One day, she returned with a hawk feather braided into her hair and a fresh scar on her hand. "I saw her," she said. "Mama, in the stream." Mako did not question. He simply nodded. "She walks with you." Lena leaned against his side. "She said your time is close, but not to be afraid, that I would remember for both of us." Mako did not weep, though his heart stirred. "Then I am at peace," he said, "because I know you will carry the fire." Together, they planted sage around the outer edges of their meadow. Not for protection, but for remembrance. For cleansing. For gratitude. Each plant became a marker of how far they had come. For every trial, a bloom. For every loss, a leaf. For every love, a root that held the earth steady. The meadow became their song. And Lena, now grown, was its voice. He died in the middle of the story. His voice had been soft that morning, like river mist, curling low in the corners of their lodge as he described the time a great hawk had stolen a child's bread only to return it the next day, filled with berries and a feather as blue as the sky. Lena had smiled, resting her chin on her knees, her hands stained from shelling corn. But halfway through the tale, his voice caught not from emotion, but from age. He paused, blinked slowly at her, then closed his eyes. Just for a breath. One long, quiet breath. And then he did not open them again. Lena did not cry, not at first. She simply leaned forward, placed her hand against his chest, and waited. The warmth was still there, faint and fading, like the last ember of a long fire. She whispered, "I remember, Papa." And the wind outside sighed through the grass like it knew. The meadow stood still for a full day. No birds sang. No travelers arrived. Even the river, once restless and playful, slid quiet beneath the ice-crusted stones. Lena sat beside him the entire night, the fire casting long shadows on the walls, the scent of sage thick in the air. When morning came, she dressed him in his finest hide, the one he wore when telling sacred stories. She braided his hair as her mother had once braided hers, threading through it a single red ribbon and one white feather, the same feather she had found the day she saw her mother's reflection in the stream. She painted his face with ochre and ash, not for battle, but for journey. Then she carried him, alone and unshaken, down to the river. The same river where her mother had once sung, where Mako had once buried his grief and built his hope anew. There, beneath the cottonwoods, she dug the earth with her hands. Slow, steady, ritual, the river watched. The wind listened. She placed him in the ground with offerings, his old bow now carved with peace symbols, his medicine pouch, and the story scrolls he had written for her. She sang over the grave not a wailing song of sorrow, but a song of passage. Her voice was strong, melodic, echoing both the old rhythms and the new ones she had crafted herself. When it was done, she sat back and whispered, "You carried the story, now I carry you." Days passed. The sun returned. Birds came back to the trees, and the meadow began to stir again, as if waking from a long breath. Lena moved with the same grace she always had, but something in her had changed, settled. She was not a girl anymore, nor just the daughter of a chief. She was a keeper now, a vessel, a storyteller. And as she stepped into her mornings, as she lit the fire, fetched water, tended plants, or welcomed wanderers, her father's voice lived in everything she did. One evening, a young boy arrived alone, ragged and wide-eyed, clutching a stick like a weapon. She brought him soup, sat across the fire, and waited. When he finally looked up, he asked, "Is it true? That a chief lived here? That he gave up everything for a little girl?" Lena smiled. "It's more than true. It's a song now." And she began to tell it. Not as Mako had told it. Not in his voice, but in hers, woven with the lilt of her mother, the strength of her father, and the fire of her own becoming. And as she spoke, the boy leaned forward, entranced, the stick slipping from his hand. The story became his too. Later, by the river, she knelt and touched the water. The current rippled against her skin, cool and clean. She looked across its flow and saw not ghosts, but guardians, those who had come before her, watching, waiting, remembering. "She sounds like Mama," she whispered, the same words she had spoken years ago, when the world had been new and terrifying. But this time, there was no fear in them. Only recognition, legacy. She placed a stone at the foot of her father's grave. On it, she etched his name. Not the one the world had called him, but the one she had given him, Papa, the one who chose love, the one who remembered mercy, the one who broke the circle to make it whole again. The wind carried her breath across the grass, and in the distance, somewhere deeper than sound, the river whispered it back.